Foundations. We're very excited for our conversation today, and I want to say two things for everybody. One is we're on the record, just want to remind everybody, and second is I will jump to the conversation with the Right Honorable Andrew Mitchell for the first 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and answers from everybody. So please start sending your questions through Estelle's email, and then from there we'll jump to your questions. Honorable Andrew Mitchell, thanks very much for joining us today. It's so good to see you, and we want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to engage in a conversation with you this afternoon.
It's a real pleasure to join you. I'm speaking to you from my constituency, right in the middle of the United Kingdom, in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield. And although it's been very bad weather, the sun is shining, I can see from the window. So it's very nice. What's the weather like in Kigali today?
It's actually very beautiful. It's around 25 Celsius.
Goodness.
It's kind of that kind of summer, spring for us. Let me call spring, which is, we don't have that kind of spring. So,
well, I'm hoping to come to Kigali as soon as I possibly can. I've got many reasons for coming, and as soon as I can, I shall.
It's always wonderful to have you back here. So let's jump a little bit into the. I was going to say, let me start with this simple, very question. So in March, the British government published the UK foreign policy review that has been going on for a year now. I just want to pick your brain. What's your thought on the outcome, and what does Africa fit in this new foreign policy direction of the United Kingdom under Boris government?
Well, the review you are referring to is the integrated review. And it is, if you like, it is Britain's statement about what global Britain means after Brexit, after leaving the European Union. And it ties together British foreign policy interests, defence interests, and development interests. And I'm afraid the development side, where Britain has always been in the past, at least over the last 2 decades, an international development leader, has taken a bit of a back seat because the government has slashed spending on development, which many of us in the governing party are very cross about. But it also expresses what Britain wants to stand up for, the international values we want to support. It talks about the widening of our alliances. And of course, Britain is one of the permanent 5 at the United Nations. It's the second most powerful power in NATO. It's also, along with Rwanda, a member of the Commonwealth, which is a very important North-South organization. And of course, English is the main language of literature and commerce. So it sort of sets out how we hope to exercise an influence for good around the world. And in terms of Africa, I'm sure that Britain will pull its weight in respect of the vaccinations and COVAX. You know, many in Africa have said to me that for a long time, Africa had to wait around for charity before the world committed to fighting the terrible scourge of HIV/AIDS, and that Africa does not expect to wait around for charity this time. And I think that's exactly right. We have to see real solidarity on vaccinating Africa and Africans, not least it's in our own interest, because we will not be safe in the United Kingdom from COVID until we are safe everywhere. This affects the whole of humanity.
And what's the other key takes from this report review?
Well, I think the key takes from the report are that Britain will continue to be a very strong partner of Europe, but outside the European Union. Britain is still a European power. We will expect to, if anything, rejuvenate our relationship with the United States, and that we will focus more on the Pacific and the East, which we sometimes feel we have neglected a bit. And we expect, for example, that vessels from our Navy will be going round into the Pacific and will be involved in joint military exercises with New Zealand and Australia, and indeed Singapore, and quite possibly India. So we are making it clear that we regard ourselves as a global power, and that leaving Europe is not a diminution of Britain, but in fact it's an increase, we hope, in our influence and our efforts overseas.
So you just touched a little bit about Brexit. I'm very interested to hear your view about what will be the impact of Brexit on the UK and African relationship in a long time.
Well, I think that potentially it's beneficial for Africa because it means Britain can conclude trading arrangements, which we haven't been able to do for the last 50 years, because our trading arrangements with African countries were governed by the EU and the EU's seat on the World Trade Organization, the WTO. So Britain has had no independent trade negotiations at all since we joined the European Union back in the early 70s. So potentially it means that Britain can negotiate agreements which are more favorable, I hope, to African countries. I've always believed that trading out of poverty was one of the key beliefs of British development. And clearly, if we are able to do deals which encourage Africa to sell into Britain and into Europe, that's a good thing for both our countries, both the African country in question and for Britain. So I think that's another one of the effects. I would not have left the European Union had it been up to me, and I voted against doing so, but I am a Democrat and I accept the decision to leave the European Union. And I think there will be some diminution in our trading arrangements with the European Union, but equally there will be more trade to be done with other countries that are not part of the European Union. And some of those countries are growing much faster, particularly in Africa, for example, where before the pandemic, Rwanda had one of the highest rates of growth in Africa. I think particularly in the growing parts of the world, Britain will be lighter on its feet than it would be as part of the European Union.
So I want to a little bit touch on this trend. We're seeing, Brexit may be coming from the same space of this anti-globalization. Sometimes that extend to, anti-foreign aid for countries. What could you tell, people in the UK or people in the United States, specifically from the Trump base, that developed countries who believe, supporting other countries, they should keep spending more money in foreign aid?
Well, one shouldn't overstate the importance of foreign aid because, for example, in terms of flows into Africa, it is much less than either remittancing or indeed direct foreign investment. But it is nevertheless an important way to build safer and more conflict-free societies and more prosperous societies. So, for example, the use of aid to help build governing structures, to help promote accountability in a country like Somalia, which had been going rather well until relatively recently, is of benefit to the countries giving the aid because it makes those countries safer and more prosperous as well. Ungoverned space, wherever it is, whether it's in northeast Syria or in Somalia and the Horn of Africa, is not in our interests. And, aid goes to help solve humanitarian situations. Look at the dreadful humanitarian problems that have arisen in Tigray with many hundreds of thousands of people fleeing over the border into South Sudan. Aid organized, whether multilaterally or unilaterally, makes an enormous difference to the ability of people in desperate circumstances to survive.
And speaking of Europe, a little bit on this, the rising of extremist parties in Europe. What is that at the heart of this rising of these extremist political parties we see in Europe?
Well, I think it happens in part because of immigration. There's no doubt about that. And, the international rules-based system has gone backwards in recent years, something which I think is deeply regrettable and is very important to us. And why is it important? Because all the big problems that face us in the future, so climate change, pandemics now, we're very clear about that, although someone like Bill Gates was talking about it 5 or 6 years ago. But climate change, pandemics, terrorism, protectionism, which beggars us all if we have protectionist and a protectionist rather than an open market approach to trade, and migration. And, to tackle all those things, we need more international collaboration, whereas actually the world's moving in a narrow nationalist way, as President Trump and President Putin and even the Chinese President Xi Jinping, all emphasize that point. So I think that is a regrettable point, and we need to try and encourage the more strength into the international rule-based system, so that that can look after all of us rather than this narrow nationalist-based approach to governing our international relations and affairs. I've lost you. You're on.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know. Just say, speaking of Trump, I'm very interested. What's your thought on the long-term impact of Trump presidency on the European Union in general?
Well, he was not a fan of the European Union, and he was very strongly in favour of Britain leaving the European Union. He thought we'd be much better off outside it. I think that his politics now are in abeyance in America, and I think the Americans are a good democratic country. They will give the Biden administration every chance, and the Biden administration has started quite well, and it's certainly much more internationalist than President Trump was. But I think that the caution for people like me who don't like what President Trump's approach to international affairs, the caution is that we should remember that he got the second highest number of votes in an American presidential election ever. And that is a sobering fact, you know, that very large numbers of Americans, unprecedented numbers of Americans, gave him their support. And, you know, Democrats like me need to take some humility in examining that.
What, just for a follow-up on this question, as you mentioned, he got the highest number of voters. What do you do to change this trend of anti-globalization, anti-international militarism? I'm very interested. What do we do to change this?
Well, the main thing is to demonstrate that globalization is good for everyone. And what globalization, I'm afraid, has meant is that quite a lot of people feel excluded from it. And that's a very dangerous state of affairs, because people who feel excluded tend to react against a system that has made them feel excluded. So I think the key thing is to make globalization work for everyone, and that requires much more international collaboration. It's very difficult for any country now to pull up the shutters and say, you know, we're going to be Fortress UK or Fortress Rwanda. You just can't do it now. Yeah. So I think we need to make sure that globalization works for the many and not the few, to coin a cliche.
Yeah. So just a little bit back here on the continent, you mentioned a little bit of trade, and I would love if you could go deeper in other areas. What do you see opportunities and partnership between the United Kingdom and Africa moving forward?
Well, we have troops now in the Sahel. We have troops in Mali, and indeed, you know, Rwanda has had troops in the past, I think in Sudan, but certainly in Sudan, but also in other parts of Africa as well, keeping the peace. So Britain is putting its shoulder to the wheel in terms of keeping the peace. Britain will also, I think, be a voice for free trade, as we've discussed. And I hope Britain will also be speaking up for the importance of development and the importance of vaccinations as well, which without which Africa will, you know, the divide that you were talking about just now from globalization will be exacerbated. It will get worse unless we ensure that Africa is vaccinated. So I think that's one of the things, and also working through the multilateral organizations. The African Development Bank is very important on the continent, and Britain is a very strong supporter. We have recently replenished the amount of money we give to the African Development Bank to aid development and lending and banking processes and so on. And I am myself an advisor to the African Development Bank, and I note from that work what an important organization it is, and I'm very pleased that Britain is backing it.
So speaking of militarism, which you just touched a little bit, how important you know, militarism after we saw Trump presidency and this pandemic, COVID going on now?
How important is
how important militarism is? You just mentioned a little bit of
militarism.
No, militarism. Also militarism. Sorry.
Bilateralism.
Yes, but
yes, it is. I mean, I've been talking about the multilateral approach, but the bilateral approach Britain has very close relations with Rwanda. It has very close relations across East Africa, in particular, of course, with Kenya and Uganda. But in East Africa, we have very close relations indeed with Nigeria and with Ghana and Sierra Leone. And further south, although the relationship is deeply mired in Zimbabwe at the moment, with South Africa particularly, Britain is, we have deep historical links and heritage with South Africa. So Britain has enormous interests in Africa. And of course, those interests are in ensuring that there is peace and stability, because that's the way that people elevate their living standards, and trade takes place for the enrichment of us all. These are very important interests for Britain, and they are the bilateral interests to which you referred.
So just a little bit to end here. What can we learn from this COVID pandemic going on in your view? What lesson can we learn from this pandemic?
Well, I think the first and most important lesson we learn is that pandemics are a real threat to our world today. And, God forbid that we look back and say that this one was pretty benign because it mainly affected older people. Imagine if the pandemic had targeted children or younger people, it would have been, even more ghastly than it has been for the world. And so I think the first and most important lesson is that we have to guard against pandemics. And we're all in this together. It's not just the rich world looking after itself. We're all in this together. It's very, very important indeed. The second lesson that I think that we learn is the importance of multilateralism, the importance of boosting that view by ensuring we have the structures in place to give real strength to a multilateral approach so that the poorer countries don't feel out on a limb. And I think we may well need new organizations to do that. I mean, the WHO under Dr. Tedros, the former Ethiopian health minister, I think has had a very good war in the sense that they've got a lot of their calls right, and I think that Tedros is a very good leader. But we may need to strengthen the World Health Organization under his leadership, and we may indeed need to find specific vaccination-related methods or structures to help combat future pandemics. But I think those are the two key lessons that we learn around international solidarity.
Yeah. So before I open for questions for the audience for asking questions, just my last question is: looking what Rwanda has achieved in the last 27 years, what lesson can the world learn from Rwanda?
Well, Rwanda is a remarkable success story because recovering from the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis is when the country was, in a state that it is very hard to find the words to describe. Rwanda has recovered from that, and you land in Kigali, you see a city that is clean and neat and well run. The social indices in Rwanda in terms of children going to school, in terms of maternal and child health, in terms of ease of doing business, lack of corruption, these are all huge pluses. And it is because Rwanda has been so successful in state building that Rwanda is such a beacon and such an example. And if